Here we're going to talk about the Loopy training principle. This is a part of training that I really feel like we need to cover before we dive into our exercises, just as kind of a theory, background information, something to keep in mind with all of the training that you're going to do going forward. So the Loopy training principle and this training framework come from Alexandra Kurland. She is an absolutely phenomenal trainer, a wealth of knowledge. She's really the pioneer of clicker training in the horse world. So I highly recommend, if you would like more information on her or just on clicker training in general, that you check out her website and her books. I've listed a couple here. Her website, theclickercenter.com, and her book, The Click That Teaches. Phenomenal resources. Highly recommend. But when we're talking about clicker training, some things to keep in mind are, if we want really great training, we need to have these 3 criteria. We need clear, well-defined training criteria. We need really great timing, and we need a high rate of reinforcement. So those are essential for keeping our learners engaged, making sure they understand what's being asked of them, and making sure they understand what part of each behavior is being targeted, being rewarded. That's where the timing comes into play. We also need to be able to split our criteria down into chunks that are a manageable size for the learner so that they can be successful and understand what we're trying to achieve. So if we are wanting a more complex behavior, it's really unfair to ask the horse to just know what we want, to read our minds and complete the behavior all in one go. So for example, if the behavior we're looking for is loading on a trailer, that's a pretty complex behavior with a lot of moving parts. So expecting them to walk right up when we cue them to walk on the trailer for the very first time is not exactly a reasonable request. So we might want to break it down into first step 1 of just sniffing the ramp, and then maybe a foot on the ramp, and then maybe 2 feet on the ramp, and then 3, and then 4, and then step into the trailer, and on and on. So we break it down into those manageable little pieces, and each horse is going to have a different threshold for how quickly you can move through those. But once we have each piece going well, you can start to add to it and add pieces together, and then ultimately you end up with the complete behavior. Lumping large chunks of criteria together without breaking them down first is really a recipe for frustration, and on the part of the horse and on the part of the trainer, and it's not going to be as successful. So when we're talking about loopy training, I think about every time we cue a behavior, we're initiating a loop. So we cue the behavior happens, we click, and then we deliver reinforcement, and then the cycle begins again. So you'll see as we get into some of these exercises, you're gonna see the loops happening pretty quickly, and it's a little bit different from more traditional training in the sense that we're doing things in loops and cycles, repeating behavior, repeat. So we want nice, clean loops. What is a clean loop? That means that there's no unwanted behavior in the loop. So if I'm asking my horse to put his nose in the halter, but he's also lifting his head up first and then putting it in the halter, and I don't change that loop, I keep that as my loop, and then I start to add the next step to it, I'm going to still have that behavior of lifting the head up first, and really what I want is maybe for him to put his head down. So if you find that you've trained something and you realize there's an unwanted piece in there, the good news is you can always go back and retrain that loop and get it nice and clean and how you want it, and then add the pieces back together. So all is not lost if you get a messy loop, but for precision and for efficiency and all of that stuff, we really want to try to keep our loops nice and clean from the start. Another piece with your loops is to minimize hesitation after a cue. So as you're going forward in training, when we present the halter to the horse, we'd like him to march right up and stick his head in, and off we go. If we hold the halter out and he kind of thinks about it for a second, and he kind of looks at it and looks away and looks back and then moseys on over, that's maybe, completing the task of putting his head in the halter, but it's slow and sluggish, and it's not as crisp and clean as we'd like. So if you find that things like that are happening, that is a good sign. You need to back it up a step and see where you might be missing some crispness, some clarity in some of the earlier stages. So once you have your nice clean loops repeating, that's when we know that we can increase our criteria. So that might mean making a criteria harder, or it might mean combining multiple behaviors into a chain or something like that. So I like to get between 3 and 5 clean repetitions before moving on. That to me just feels like enough to know that the horse really does understand what he's supposed to be doing, while also not being so many repetitions that it's boring and monotonous and he's checking out. So 3 to 5 is your guideline, but of course it's always going to be dependent on your own situation, and nothing there is set in stone. And as I mentioned before, if your loops aren't clean, we risk training in behaviors you didn't intend, and that's when you can kind of get messy behaviors that aren't as crisp. So just something to keep in mind, not something to panic over, but just you can kind of watch as you're going forward and catch yourself earlier so that you can fix things before they get too set in the behavior. So all of this being said, just something to keep in mind throughout the course, something to keep in mind with your training. We want things to repeat. We want them nice and clean, and that just keeps everything really clear for the horse so they understand what's going on. The hard thing with animal training, right, is that we can't explain verbally to the animal what we want them to do. So we are using the clicker, we're using our cues, we're using our training to develop a system of communication with the horse so that the horse can understand, and we can minimize frustration, and we can make training enjoyable for everybody.